Okay, let's discuss the common network attacks that occur. Now, throughout the course we already mentioned a couple of them, but right now let's see how exactly do they work and what can we do to prevent an attack on the network. Now, some of the network attacks, as I said, we already talked about. For example, we talked about targeting devices or endpoint devices which are a part of the network. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to affect the network, but it potentially could, since a compromised device could lead to a compromised network. We also saw how we can target routers, and routers are a crucial part of every network. Getting access to them can be considered as entire network being compromised. But there is another famous attack that we didn't talk about yet, which is man-in-the-middle attack. Essentially a threat to all the devices on the network, since man-in-the-middle attack is pretty much an attacker trying to sniff data and traffic incoming and outgoing from one or all the machines on the network. Now, we will explain it in a little more detail in a few seconds, but first, let's see how we can divide the network attacks. So, we can briefly divide them into most common network attacks, which are denial of service attacks, where larger botnets simply overload the traffic and make a service or entire network unusable and unreachable. Besides these, we have already mentioned the man-in-the-middle attacks and the attacks that we already covered, which are unauthorized access attacks, which can refer to an endpoint device or router being compromised, whether through a vulnerability or through a weak password. Now, since these ones we already talked about, let's focus on explaining how a man-in-the-middle attack works. First, we have a network. Let's say this network has a router and 4 devices connected to it, out of which one of them is our attacker that wants to perform man-in-the-middle attacks. The easiest way to do so is to manipulate something called ARP packets. Now, ARP packets are used inside the network so each device can find another device that it wants to communicate with. We already know that inside the network, we can identify a device by its IP address, but also by its MAC address. Now, while the IP addresses can change, the MAC addresses will always stay the same. The way a device finds out which device has which IP address is by sending ARP requests and getting back ARP responses. In plain words, ARP request is simply a device asking the network who is someone. Since we are talking about network devices, the question would look something like this. Who is or who has 192.168.1.1? This would be sent out to the broadcast, and once the machine that has the wanted IP responds back, we would then know the MAC address that belongs to that IP and vice versa. This is possible with the help of the ARP tables that every device has, where it maps the MAC address to the device's current IP address, and it does that for all the devices that it needs to communicate with. But this protocol has a vulnerability, in a sense that we can send ARP responses to different devices and pretend that we are someone else, and that device that we send the ARP response to will accept that as a correct input for their ARP table. For example, if an attacker wanted to sniff network traffic from just one device on the network, he could do something like this. He would send an ARP response to both the victim and the router saying that he is one another. To the router, he would send an ARP response saying that he is the victim, and to the victim, he would send the ARP response saying that he is router. Their ARP tables would then generate these entrances, and from this point, all the packets that the victim machine is sending would go to the attacker's machine, who would then be able to inspect them and see all the data that is not encrypted in plain text. Same goes for traffic that is going to the target machine. Now, this can be done by an attacker who is targeting 1, 2, or all the devices on the network. It's completely his or her choice. Certain basic measures that we can take to prevent this are to, as we mentioned, already in the last few lectures to have strong credentials for the wireless access point, to have strong router credentials. Besides that, we ideally want to visit only HTTPS websites and not HTTP, since our traffic won't be encrypted, and any password that we input into an HTTP website, if the attacker is sniffing the network connection, he would then see it in plain text. And another layer would be to also use VPN. Nonetheless, this would be the basic example of a man-in-the-middle attack, which uses ARP spoofing technique to work. I just wanted to mention it so you know that it exists and it's a possible threat from a person that is already inside your network that wants to do malicious things. Nonetheless, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture.